Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us today and welcome to the MSW Journal Club. I will apologise in advance for those of you who can hear it. I've got a bit of a cold, so I might sound a little bit snuffly, and if I have to mute my mic to have a quick sneeze or a quick cough, that's all I'm doing. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a heads up regarding that as before. So yeah, if you'd like to start introducing yourselves in the chat, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much for coming. I can see some familiar faces and I can see some not familiar faces, so you are all very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. So we will slowly start to make a start, if that's okay. So brief introductions. Like I said, if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat, but my name is Rob. I am a practice development midwife for maternity support workers, and I work at Birmingham Women's Hospital in Birmingham in the Midlands. And so that is who I am. Welcome to the MSW Journal Club. So I always like to start this off from the point of making a bit of a mission statement. So the MSW Journal Club was originally founded as an educational resource free at the point of use for maternity support workers, as a way of introducing and guiding their journey into evidence-based care and research. As we have progressed, we've started to touch on some specific topics. Every time we try and address a topic that is either relevant to the MSW role, or it might talk about an element of the role that you might not have had much chance to engage with. This is supplemented both with these webinars, and we also have a monthly email service. So if you're not part of that email service, please do me a favor, put your email in the chat and I will gladly add you to it. We do 4 pieces of research a month. That are sent with the PDF files attached directly to your inbox, and then that gives you the opportunity to catch up on some research, and I'll do a little bit of a synopsis on each one, and it gives you an opportunity for a brief few analysis points. So on today's topic, we are going to have a very quick rapid reflection point utilising the chat. I'd like you to, if you feel comfortable to, I'd like to have a quick think about how often you use social media per day. You can do it in minutes, you can do it in hours if you're really into TikTok. And how often do you use it for information? So again, I'm not necessarily talking about just having a doom scrolling through Instagram. I'm talking more about you're interested in a topic and you're utilizing social media as a point of access to gain more information on that. And it could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be healthcare related for yourself. It could be something as simple as I want to get into running. I might look at a TikTok account, or I want to get into baking. I'll see if there's any good Instagram accounts. So just have a little bit of a think about that. And like I said, if you feel comfortable, please share that within the chat, just to start getting your brains into the right sort of zone for what we're talking about today. And what we are talking about today is social media use in pregnancy. So to give a bit of a background about social media use itself, because I think it's really important when we look at a topic within pregnancy, it's important to have a baseline sometimes to give point of reference to what things are happening outside of pregnancy. So as you can see here, this data is taken from a digital data analyst website that produced this report in March, I think. But the data itself is quite fresh. It's from January 2024. They're probably due to release another one, but this is their most recent one. So in the UK itself, 97.5% of the population of the UK own a smartphone. Of that number, there are 56.2 million social media users. 84.7% of that population use at least one social media app, and that's at least one. The proportion of social media use when broken down by sex is very, very similar. We have a 49.9% female versus a 50.1% male. The average personal use per day is 1 hour and 49 minutes total for that 24-hour period. And then this was quite interesting to me, that the app most used in terms of the amount of people accessing it is still Facebook, and that's where it has a 73% of internet users, 16 to 64, are still utilizing Facebook. What is also interesting is if you then change that statistic and then look at the app that has the most amount of time spent on it, as opposed to how many people use it. So the average person's amount of time using an app is TikTok. And what's really, and probably unsurprisingly, I think, if you look at the data at how much time each person spends on each app, TikTok is, it's gone. You've got Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then TikTok's up here somewhere. So very quickly from the floor, anybody see anything on there that they'd like to comment on, or that they find surprising, or anything like that? If you put your hand up, I can unmute you. Or if you don't feel comfortable putting your hand up and speaking out loud, you're more than welcome to put something in the chat as well. That's absolutely fine. And as Jake has put in the chat as well, if you do have a question at any point, we will try and circle back. So yeah, like I said, I think those are some really interesting statistics, and I think that they paint a very interesting picture of the world outside of pregnancy. So if we then move forward into pregnancy itself, so social media in pregnancy, it's a common source of information now for pregnant people, especially younger people. It has been recognized as a source of positive support. So that is seen in a lot of areas in terms of sort of peer-to-peer support. The most common reason for pregnant women to access social media is for information. It's that sort of, yeah, they are looking for something specifically. However, the issue with this is obviously, in terms of, as with everything in social media, there are algorithms in place. There are adverts or affiliated content. So you might have a social media influencer that has a deal or an agreement with a certain product or a certain company, and that can dictate the sort of information that they put out. So they might recommend a certain product over something else. And the other thing is, as well, is that they are not necessarily evidence-based. So there's a lot of data in the papers that I've cited in this slide that shows that the majority of what people are discussing, especially who are not healthcare professionals, a lot of it is either personal experience or personal opinion. And obviously that's very difficult because it's difficult to regulate it. It's difficult to have eyes on what people are researching and what they're hearing in that space. But additionally, it's very difficult when they sort of come to us and say, well, I've heard X or I've read X within that as well. The best sources of information, unsurprisingly, are the accounts run by healthcare professionals. So that's been found to have the highest level of credibility and evidence base within it. And we are starting to see an increase in these healthcare professional accounts starting to be deployed, which is really, really good to see. So we are starting to see more and more people. Again, I'm going to give people an opportunity now just to sort of chime in if they feel comfortable. I'm just going to quickly look at the chat. I can see that Sakina has said that she really felt that Facebook was on the way out in reference to what we spoke about on the previous slide. Me too. Me too. I was very surprised to see how popular Facebook was still. And I think that's a very, very interesting statistic. I can also see that Alison has said that the rise of AI is worrying as it's not evidence-based either. So AI within social media is very interesting. We are seeing a rise in social media AI-generated content. It's not always the easiest to spot as well. So that's a very good point, that actually when we look at this topic and you are producing content that is addressing things like pregnancy, there isn't a lot of accountability for those people, especially if they stipulate, you know, this is my personal opinion. Legally, it can kind of get them off the hook. but they could then go on to say something that's completely not evidence-based, and it's going to have an effect. They influence people. They are influencers. That's their role. So it's very, very important to sort of bear that in mind. I think the other thing for me as well within social media that's very interesting, especially when you're dispensing advice regarding something like healthcare, is that healthcare research is consistently ploughing forward. We're always finding out new things. And so we obviously replace old information and evidence with newer evidence. However, unless you are combing the internet, for example, if I made a video on social media and pregnancy, which we are doing right now, obviously, but if we make this video, and something changes, it's very important that we have the ability to sort of either produce more information to be able to rectify what we've said, or to remove it completely. So it's very difficult to have that accountability. So yes, like I said, in terms of how social media and pregnancy works, there are benefits, but there are also most definitely concerns and things to consider. So why is this important? What at the end of the day, you're pregnant, you look on Instagram or you look on TikTok. Why is this important? Well, so social media itself has a very large impact, including outside of pregnancy. It's been linked with a lot of mental health conditions, depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and those don't stop in pregnancy. In fact, they are absolutely exacerbated. So misinformation, like I spoke about before, can lead to uninformed decision making and potential harm. It may set what people see within social media about their sort of pregnancy, about other people's pregnancy. As with everything on social media, it's very airbrushed. You see a lot of the time you see what the best or the sort of highlights or the greatest hits of somebody's experience. You know, we don't post about everything that happens in our day-to-day lives on social media, but you'll post about the good stuff or the big things, and that can set an unrealistic expectation within pregnancy. And that there's actually evidence to suggest that can lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms, as it states there. It does increase the perinatal depressive symptoms as well, so you're more likely to see those sort of mental health conditions. And it can negatively impact on an individual's self-perception and their self-esteem as well. So we're looking at a very, very complicated picture here of the impact on social media on perinatal mental health. As we know, this is already a very important topic to discuss at the moment. So actually, this is a very, very key area that could be having a very large impact. When we look at the impact that this has on members of key stakeholders within this journey, obviously, first and foremost, the birthing person themselves can have not only not only mental impacts, but also physical impacts on their well-being. Moving forward, we've got the baby themselves, both in utero. It can impact, it has several risk factors for the baby before they've been born and after they've been born into their later life. And again, to complete the picture, when we have a partner, we know that partners' mental health is symbiotic. So if your partner is feeling down or depressed or anxious, it's going to impact that, and that is absolutely true within pregnancy. And so actually, we're going to then start to move forward where social media, if we paint this picture, it starts to impact the whole family unit. And so it's very, very important that we have an awareness of this and are able to support people effectively if they feel that this is starting to impact them. So another quick reflection point for you. You can pop this in the chat. You can put your hand up, whatever you'd like to do, whatever you feel confident to do. How many people or their families speak to you about information that they read online? Is this a common thing that you're seeing quite regularly? Are people coming to you saying, oh, I saw a TikTok or I saw an Instagram post about, I'm trying to think, about formula feeding, using a bottle, and it said X and Y. And are you seeing people come with accurate things, do you think? Or are you seeing things that are completely off the mark? I I can share with you actually that I did have somebody come to me with a question not so long ago, and they asked me if through misinformation what they read online, they asked me if we were now having to ask dads or male birthing partners if they were pregnant, and it was one of those situations where I wasn't quite sure what to say in that regard, because it was such an unusual question. But again, it gave me an opportunity to sort of speak about, actually, we're now introducing the use of pronouns within perinatal services, which is a very good thing. You know, we do have some trans men who are pregnant and can become pregnant and have a baby. So actually, that might be where you're getting that information, but it is not our job to ask men who are assigned male at birth if they're pregnant. So again, that seems like a very small interaction and something that, but it provides an opportunity to correct and to help guide people more accurately in the information that they are discerning from online. And also it gave me an opportunity to ask him where he'd read that. So it meant that I could go and try and find it myself and actually see where this was coming through. But yeah, have a bit of a reflection about whether you think that you are being asked this by birthing people and their families. And yeah, as I said, it just gives us a good opportunity to address it. So moving forward onto the main event, what are we looking at today? So I hope that you've had a bit of a chance to have a little look at this. We do release the paper that we're looking at ahead of time. So if anyone has had an opportunity to look at this, great. If you haven't, don't worry, we are going to go through it. So this is a paper by Muskins et al. From 2024, and it's called Browsing Throughout Pregnancy, the Longitudinal Course of Social Media During Pregnancy. So what did they do? So this paper was set out to look at the, to assess the intensity and problematic social media use over the course of pregnancy from the first to third trimester. The secondary aim of this study was to assess whether primiparous and multiparous women differed in their social media use over the course of pregnancy. Based on existing literature, they made a prediction that we expect to see a U-shaped pattern of social media use during pregnancy, with an increase in the first and third trimesters. So they were expecting to see high use in the first trimester, slightly lower in the second, and then back up for the third. And they also were expecting to find higher social media use scores in primiparous women in comparison to multiparous women. So as you can see from the slide there, this paper was undertaken in the Netherlands. They recruited 1,135 individuals between January 2020 and July 2022. This study was undertaken as part of a larger study, so it almost had a parent study above it. So they were undertaking a larger study, and as part of that, they actually did a secondary, smaller study within it. The people within the cohort were all of a low risk pregnancy. So I know we, as a NHS, we're trying to move away from the terms of low risk and high risk if we can, but that is the language that was used within this paper, so that's why I've tried to use it within this situation. But it was a lower risk cohort, so more likely to see sort of midwifery led care. They then released questionnaires at 12, 20 and 28 weeks, and they were asked about their social media usage at these gestations. These responses were then analysed they were assessing the amount of time spent in social media, the amount of times they visited social media, and they were assessing for signs of social media addiction within these cohorts. Okay. So what did they find? So their key findings from this were that social media use was lowest in the first trimester and then increased throughout pregnancy. There were minimal differences between groups when they assessed their cohorts characteristics, such as age, race, education, and also with parity. However, the one thing that they did find that was statistically significant was that first-time parents having their first pregnancies had significantly higher use in their second trimester than their people who had had a baby before. Additionally to this, 10.5% of their cohort were showing significant evidence of a social media addiction, and that triggered their score that they'd used. And additionally, that this was more likely in those that had a previous history of depressive symptoms. So the results that you can see here are sort of laid out a little bit more clearly. So the top graph, sorry, the left-hand graphs are for everybody, so the entire cohort. And the ones on the right are separated by first-time parents and people who'd had children before. So as you can see here, with my wonderful use of emojis, as we are on social media, with the first graph at the top here is the amount of time that was spent on social media in pregnancy. So as you can see, for everybody, it started quite low in the first trimester, increased, and then increased even further into the third. And then for multiparous and primiparous, so the first timers are the black line, you can see that actually there is a massive gap here with the second trimester readings, and then the third trimester readings and the first aren't far enough away to be statistically significant. The frequency again started quite low, increased quite dramatically increased for the second, and then steadily increased for the third. And you can see here that actually there's a lot of overlap between the primiparous and the multiparous cohorts here, so that there isn't anything statistically significant to separate them. And then when we look at the social media addiction score, again, it follows the very natural trend of quite low in the first trimester, quite high, dramatic increase in the second, and then steady increase in the third. And you can see here, because these cohorts cross over in these grey lines here, that means that they're not statistically significant. So although we can see some results in this graph, it means that they are not far enough apart that we can draw an accurate and reliable conclusion from them. Has anybody got any thoughts on what we've seen so far from the study itself, what they were looking at, and their results? Either you can put yourself in the chat, or if you feel confident, you can put your hands up. Just gives me a chance to quickly wet my whistle because my throat's very dry. No? Okay. You're a very quiet bunch today. I can see that there's some comments in the chat that we will have a little look at towards the end, because they refer to some of the stuff that we've spoken about before. But we will come back to those in a second. So there's a few things that I want to talk about, and I will really encourage you to engage with this bit, because this is where we get the chance to really discuss and scrutinize and evaluate the paper itself. So please, as I said, have your chat boxes ready, or have your hands ready to pop up. Like I said, first things first, their sample size. So they actually had a sample size of just over 1,100 people. So any thoughts on that? Anyone have any thoughts on that for a sample size? Do you think that's pretty good? Do you think that's pretty bad? What are your thoughts? I can see Sakina's just writing something in the chat. Okay, so the sample size was just over 1,100, and I think that's a pretty good sample size myself. As it goes, that's pretty reliable. That's pretty good. When we look next at the cohort itself, as I said before, they deemed it a low-risk cohort. So it was mostly women, birthing people, sorry, with straightforward pregnancies, who did not have a lot of complications. So I think there's a very interesting argument to be said there, whether that would affect your likelihood of addressing or accessing rather information via social media. I think that's a really interesting discussion. There is an argument to say that if you have more further complications within your pregnancy, either with yourself or with the baby, then you might choose to access external sources of information, such as social media. However, I have also heard an argument to say that actually, if you have a little bit more involvement because of that complication, so if you're having regular scans or if you're having regular clinic appointments with an obstetrician or a midwife, then you might not be gaining as much access to information as you would do in that situation if you're having fairly straightforward pregnancy. And so actually, you might be more likely to access information in a more casual fashion, because you're not having that additional input from the services that are keeping an eye on your pregnancy. So I think that there's a very interesting argument to be had there. When we look at the cohort characteristics, the characteristics within this study were a predominantly white cohort. I think there was about 70-80% white, with a education at least a bachelor's degree of about 74%, something like that. So I think it's very interesting to sort of look at that cohort, and it seems very there isn't a broad spectrum of race and education within that, both of which could have an impact on your likelihood to engage with traditional services such as a health service, and also your ability to where you might choose to access information. So I think it's very, very interesting to look at this in the sense that it is quite accurate in terms of how it reflects the population of the Netherlands, and it seems to be quite an accurate reflection of that. However, what that does do, and what I'd like you to think about, is how does that affect the value of this study if we were to then take it to the UK, or we were to take it to America or something like that? Like, were we likely to see the same sort of results with a different cohort of different races and different educations? The next thing I wanted to pick up on was that when they designed this study, the way they collated the data for how much people use social media was that it was self-reported. So they asked somebody in the last month, how many times have you been on social media? Now, I don't know if I could accurately tell you that now from myself. I access social media. You might have it, you might have certain times where you might be like, oh, I'll have half an hour on it when I get home, or I might have half an hour on it before I go to bed. But there are also times in the day where I might have 30 seconds, or I might have a couple of minutes if I'm making a cup of tea, I might have a quick scroll on Instagram, or I might go on TikTok. So I think that a self-reported social media use is a very, very interesting way of accessing this, and I think it calls into question quite a lot how accurate the data that they collected was, especially when you could have more accurate ways of doing it. There are the apps and phones themselves provide very accurate. They have monitoring systems in play now to basically keep an eye on how much time that you're spending on social media, and you as a user have the ability to limit that. So that is a perfectly viable alternative option, and you would be able to evidence that quite clearly. Additionally, you could have used cellular data from a network carrier if you wanted to go really fancy with it. So I think that asking somebody to accurately recount how much social media they've used in the last month, or in that trimester, is not the best way of collecting the data. Additionally, following on from that, when they were asked about the social media that they accessed, the quote that I've given there in speech marks actually says Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Twitter, and YouTube, etc. And that was everything that they were given as an example. That was how when you said how much time you spent on social media, and then as an example, they put that. So quite evidently, that doesn't include every social media platform for a start. It also doesn't tell us which ones they were accessing. It doesn't tell us, were you accessing mostly Instagram? TikTok's not even on there. And this was from 2020 to 2022 when TikTok was, absolutely skyrocketed and has continued to do. So I would make the argument that not only is that a very vague way of outlining what you're expecting from your participants, but also you're missing an opportunity to actually collate data about which ones they're accessing. Moving forward, I can see moving forward, we've got the Bergen social media addiction scale. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, you might have seen an acronym for BSMAS about how they measured social media addiction. So this was a scale that they actually used. So this is the social media addiction scale. If you've never heard of it before, don't panic, neither had I. It was a completely new tool to me. I'd never even known that this existed. However, what I did do was I did a bit of digging, and I found quite a few systematic reviews on basically verifying it as a very useful tool. So for those of you who are unaware, a systematic review is where somebody will pick a topic. In this case, this is the Bergen social media addiction scale, and they will collect the data that is available from individual papers and research, put them all together, and then generate an overall sort of review of the evidence. So if you wanted to find out something quite quickly or wanted to test something's validity, which is what they were doing with this, they can then quite safely say, we reviewed 17 papers. In total, there was, 15,000 participants in all of them. Some of them found this, some of them found that, but on the whole, most of them found that this was a very valid way of using this. So, like I said, that seems to be a very positive aspect of this paper. They used a tool that was not only validated, but seemed to be industry standard for assessing this. So that's a very positive thing. So they've used a tool that's really, really good. And I can just see that Sakina in the chat has actually just beat me to this last question. Something they didn't look at, the participants of this study were not asked what they were accessing social media for. So obviously this paper is addressing and scrutinizing social media use along the course of pregnancy, but they were never asked at any point, what were you looking on Instagram for? They could have been looking at trampolines. They could have been looking at bread recipes. They could have been looking at house decorations. But they could have also been looking for infant feeding advice. They could have been looking for birthing positions. They could have been looking for somebody talking about vitamin K and the options. Pauline, I can see you've got your hand up. Hang on, I'll just unmute you. Sorry. There we go. Try now.
Yeah, I feel they could have got a lot more over what their concerns were from each gestation. Like, were they worried about their fetal movements? Were they worried about, the growth of their baby? I feel that if they were actually asked, what is it that they were searching at this point related to birth, it could also help us as health professionals find out exactly what's worrying those mothers during those weeks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really good point. That's a really, really good point. Like you said, there's a really, really sort of a missed opportunity here. It almost feels like if you were there anyway and you were asking these questions, it could be quite easy to collect this other half of data that would add the rest of the picture. And it does seem to me that if you are scrutinizing social media in pregnancy specifically, there's kind of an underwritten assumption there that you are interested in the social media that they're accessing and why. So I think this is a very interesting. I do think this is a very interesting paper in that I think it could have been brilliant. and given us some really interesting insights as to what people are accessing at what gestation. Because you're very right that actually what you're accessing at 12 weeks, when the first questionnaire went out, is very likely not to what you're accessing at 28 weeks. And what was even more interesting, actually, that the authors themselves within this paper recognise that an additional check-in, an additional time check-in at 36 weeks might have added to the data. And I know they say hindsight is a wonderful thing, but there is a part of me that's like, well, why didn't you? You know, that seems like a fairly interesting and obvious thing to do. So yeah, like I said, it seems like half of a question to me personally. So moving forward a little bit further. So this is our little sort of assessment tool. So again, give you an opportunity, like Pauline just bravely did, to pop your hand up if you feel comfortable, or pop it in the chat. So looking at what this study aimed to do, did it achieve this? So I'm going to read it to you again because they actually wrote their main intentions down, which was very helpful of them. So the primary aim of this study was to assess the possible variability in intensity and problematic social media use over the course of pregnancy from the first to the third trimester. So they're looking at how often they utilize social media use over the course of their pregnancy, and if it becomes problematic. Do you think that they've achieved that goal as their primary aim for this study? You can, as I said, if you want to put in the chat yes or no, that's absolutely fine. Or if you want to put your hand up, that's also fine. Pauline, I can see you got your hand up.
I've got a yes and no. Yeah, they did find out. They did find out how many women use social media during their pregnancy, but I don't think they've actually found out a reason for it efficiently enough. I don't know if they found out exactly why these women are using it more increasingly.
So that's a good point. However, as I said, the primary aim of this study, according to the authors, was to look at how often and how frequently and how much time was spent, and if there were any signs of problematic use over the course of the pregnancy. So they weren't necessarily interested at this point of what they were looking at or why. They were just looking at how often they were accessing it. So I think that on balance, that's what they specifically stated they were aiming to do, they did achieve this. They did achieve that. Secondly, they looked to assess whether there was a difference between primips or multips over the course of pregnancy and how they engage with social media. And again, if we very briefly just go back a couple of slides. So yeah, they've assessed the data and they've split it between primiparous and multiparous women. They also made a couple of predictions. They expected to see a U shape, which obviously they haven't. I'm not sure what sort of shape you'd call that, like an elongated lowercase r, maybe? Yeah, that shape. And they also expected to see higher social media scores during pregnancy in primiparous women and compared to multiparous women. So actually what was interesting is that they did see it to a degree. They only saw it statistically significantly, which is the real meat of what we're looking for. We need, you know, those are the results that matter, that you can put them in the bank. They're the ones that you can count on. So actually they only saw that in the second trimester. While we're on this topic, just very briefly, I just wanted to put this to the floor. Why do you think they were expecting to see this? Why would you expect to see more social media used in a first time or a primiparous birthing person compared to a multiparous birthing person? Has anyone got any ideas? I can see Pauline's got her hand up again. If you do have any additional ideas, anyone else, if you don't feel comfortable putting your hand up, please utilize the chat if you'd like to. Pauline, yes, again, my star pupil.
I'm just trying to not keep it quiet for you, Rob. That's what I'm doing. It's because we've done it before. We don't need to look up influencers to know what we're to expect.
Yeah, I think that's a fair shout. Also, I would make the argument that there's the impact of time. Like, if you've got children already, you might not have as much time to spend on social media, as much as you'd like anyway. Like you said, you've got more of an expectation, more of a realistic expectation, and you understand how to engage with that, and what to expect. And so you might not have as much of an anxiety element to that. So yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think it's very, very interesting. And I can see their logic, but it's interesting that their findings didn't quite get there. So I'm very sorry. Moving on. What does this study do well? So, as I said, they utilise questionnaires and then retrospectively ask people to assess their social media use. I think that this study utilised an opportunity seen within a larger study, so that's a good opportunity taken. I think the foundations are pretty industry standard with the use of questionnaires. I think they do have a very good sample size. Having over 1,000 people within that cohort is a very, very good thing. I think it's very, very good. And I think they present their data well as well, from what you can see on those graphs. I think that's very, very good. Moving on to sort of issues with this study, we've kind of touched on this a little bit already. So I do think that this study definitely left with a little bit more. There was I come away from this asking some more questions that it answers, which is quite common when you're looking at evidence-based and working in research. Sometimes you go in with a certain hypothesis and you think, oh, I think we're going to find this, and actually you find it's completely different, and it means that you have to plan another three papers or three pieces of research to find out why. That's not necessarily a bad thing. However, I do feel like there was probably scope within this to ask a few more questions. If you've got that questionnaire in front of someone already, we spoke a little bit about why they were accessing social media, like which area of social media they're accessing, what their primary reason for accessing it was. Were they looking at trampolines or were they looking at vitamin K? And does this, there are also the element that they didn't look at another gestation sort of very close to term. So I think that there are elements of that which kind of bring things into question, especially when you add in, like I said earlier, about the retrospective way that they collected their data. They asked those people to reflect on how much social media they'd been engaging with, for how long and how often. Another thing is, as well, is that if you're assessing somebody's ability to, likelihood of having a social media addiction, you're asking questions such as how long can you go without social media? It could be quite obvious to the participant the sort of line of inquiry that you're taking, and so they might be worried about judgment or stigma, or they might not want to engage with that side of things, so they might not be accurately reporting those figures. Does it provide any new or valuable information? I personally would make the argument it does, to a degree. I think they could have provided more, like we said, but I do think that it provides interesting information. I think it's interesting that in terms of statistical significance, trimester is the highest peak for primiparous women to be accessing social media. Again, we don't know whether that was looking specifically at pregnancy related content or whether it was looking at general content, but it suggests that there might be something within that second trimester that people start to engage with. A personal theory of mine is that maybe because you're starting to see those physiological symptoms of pregnancy a little bit more, that maybe they're starting to access social media to sort of see if people are having similar experiences. Again, that's completely just a personal opinion, and I would probably have to do a paper and follow up on this myself to find out. So again, bit of a question for everybody. What would be your next steps in this? if you were the author of this paper, or you were somebody who'd read this paper and had access to this data, what would your next steps be for this? What would you do next? So Pauline said she'd search some topics. So I think we have kind of sort of touched on this a little bit in terms of what the possible next steps would be. I think if you, depending on whether you still had access to this cohort of people, of course, I think it would be interesting to find out what they were accessing, why. We could record it a little bit better in terms of actually if somebody gave consent into accessing their phone data about how much time they were spending in each individual app, you could collate that data very quickly, and it wouldn't be too intrusive, because you'd already be talking about that you wanted to look at their interaction with social media. I like what Pauline's discussed there. She's mentioned that actually, could we look at the influence social media had on some of their decisions? Do they feel that people social media influences changed how they thought about some things? I think that's really a really good possibility. So we're looking at our conclusions a little bit. So something we didn't pick up on here, this is a quantitative piece of research. So they weren't looking at people's sort of intentions, but they were looking at sort of raw data and hoping to collate that. The foundational design of this paper was efficient. Like I said before, it had a good sample size. The cohort design, thinking about in terms of race and education level, could be broader, even though it is reflective of the Netherlands as a main population. I think it would be interesting to see how that would affect what we class as the external validity. So taking that study and reapplying it somewhere, whether that's within the Netherlands or within another geographical location, I think it would be very interesting to see how that would change if we were to bring that into England, for example, or to the UK. They used an appropriate assessment tool in the Bergen social media addiction scale. It was an industry standard. And then, as we can see, the results did also highlight new areas of focus, which isn't necessarily an issue. That's a very common thing within research. And then moving down, when we look at the design and funding considerations. So what I meant by that was the retrospective way in which they collected their data on people's social media use, and funding in terms of, it's very easy to say, oh, well, I'd access people's phones, or I'd look at the cellular data from network providers. But actually what you might not see is that could be very expensive, and it would take more time, and you've got to pay your researchers even more. So they might have very well only been able to provide this study within their means or the budget that they had. However, I do think that we can recognize from this study that it has at least restricted the data retrieval, but also it may have compromised it, because I think if you were to look into the evidence on how accurate self-reporting of addiction would be, I don't have that data to hand personally, but I can take an educated guess and say that if you ask somebody how many cigarettes they smoke in a day, they might not be as accurate as you would hope it to be, especially to somebody who is researching that, because they may face stigma, or they may face judgment, or they may feel that they may face judgment. And finally, like I said, it potentially asks more questions than it answers. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Similar to what I was talking about earlier, it highlights new areas of focus, but it does mean that if you don't have access to this group of individuals, again, that finding that data with the same cohort is going to be quite difficult. And so that brings us to the end of social media and pregnancy. We are going to have a quick flick through the comments in a second, and we will send these slides out afterwards. So if anybody is looking at this the references page and thinking, oh, I want to go and read up on this a little bit more, I'm quite happy with this reference list. There's a few systematic reviews in there if you want to read into this a little bit more. There's some really interesting papers about how this works. So we are just going to have a quick look through the comments. if that is okay with everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Our next session is planned for November. I don't have a subject for you just yet, but I'm going to be working on that with my colleagues Jake and Heather, who have supported us. So thank you to them for helping to supply this. I hope it's given you some important information, something for you to think about, something to reflect on. If you do have any suggestions for future topics or subjects, we heavily recommend those.